Biram Mboob. Is this correct? Have I said that correctly?
That is. There's actually no official pronunciation.
There's no official pronunciation.
As in, even in Gambia,
I can call you Jeremy.
people will pronounce it differently. But MB as a sound, I don't think it really exists in English as a letter, but it's boop. Boop. It's M and B are a approximation of a noise, so it's a struggle. But
where are you from in Gambia?
My dad is from Kaur, which is a village upriver. My mom's from Banjul. Although I recently found out my dad's family was from Senegal originally. So, the country itself doesn't really mean much. His four grandfathers moved from Senegal to Gambia to set up themselves many years ago. And that's when they established themselves and, eventually just became Gambians when the British drew the border. But really, we're from Senegal originally, is what I learned last year. So I didn't know that until I met a griot to explain the entire history of their migration down from Senegal and how they established themselves and all their stories and dramas and what happened. So
griot, where did you meet him?
One of the older griots in the village, and as they're kind of passing away, I started a project to try to meet them and write down the stories, because once they're gone, it's going to be completely over. So through my dad, I met a griot, and he was able to describe that whole story and explain where in Senegal the brothers originated from, and how they started their settlement, and what happened. So it's there's a lot of epic history there that's simply passed down verbally and isn't really available in any other way.
I had a friend. So Biram, you've just had a success. Tell us about your success.
So, thanks to the African Speculative Fiction Society, I've been longlisted and shortlisted for a Nommo Award for short stories for 2018, really. So I just found out a few weeks ago that I was shortlisted, so very exciting time.
And the story's science fiction?
It is a sci-fi story, yes.
Tell us a little bit about it.
So it's at heart a story that's old school science fiction. It's got time travel. It has a interstellar gateway at its heart. So these are all ideas that I obviously picked up from reading old school science fiction, but I try to weave them in and make something of my own, just leveraging those same ideas, but using it to tell a story that I wanted to tell.
Is there, it seemed to me that at its heart it was about slavery.
It was, yes. It really is about slavery, but more fundamentally about systems and people's powerlessness within those systems. That's what I wanted to write about. So slavery is an example of the worst kind of system within which individuals have zero power. And I'm struck by a lot of the stories from the old days along the African coast around slavers dumping their slaves into the sea as soon as they were on the verge of being caught. And that's really what triggered me to start writing the story. I was reading about one of those occasions, and that's when I had the inspiration to start this story, but set it in space. So really just taking something that I found remarkable and putting it in a different setting, but telling the same story, really. I think space is just a medium, but the story at heart is the same one that we've been living in Africa for a very long time.
Would you say it was in that sense, almost quintessentially African story?
Well, for me, the themes in the story are themes that I think affect Africa. So slavery has shaped a lot of what we are today. The central event in the story is mob violence, which is something that Doesn't really happen in Gambia very much, but I've lived all over Africa, and it's a very prevalent thing in other countries. This communal violence. So that is another aspect of the African experience that I wanted to write about, almost as therapy in some ways, because it's something I've seen. I've known someone who's died in those circumstances, and writing this was really about thinking about those emotions myself and releasing them somehow, because it's something that stays with you your whole life. So I would say it's part of the African experience, unfortunately. It happens a lot more in places like Nigeria and Ghana. I think Gambia, very thankfully, is untouched by that sort of thing. But writing the story was about exploring my own feelings about that, because it's something that disturbs me deeply, because someone who I knew died in those circumstances, and I think in that way writing is therapeutic. It helps you to process your thoughts and feelings about something, and helps you to just explore it and think about it. So that's one of the ways that I use writing, and I see writing.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a bit about the incident?
Well, yeah, it was someone who I've known for 10, 15 years, throughout my childhood. He was, someone who lived with us, helped my family. And during one of the, Africans are very superstitious, and during one of the rounds of superstition, they tend to sweep through the countries. There was a rumor that witches were roaming the country and, stealing people's private parts. And people just went crazy. They just started randomly accusing and randomly lynching people in the streets. A lot of innocent people died in Ghana at the time when I lived there. And, unfortunately, someone who I know who was very dear to me, was just walking along the street and just completely at random, wrong place, wrong time, died in those circumstances. And it's something that I think about almost every week of my life since then. It's just too horrific. So writing about it was really cathartic. Mm-hmm. It's therapeutic, things that you want to process mentally. And I think things I want society to process mentally as well. The fact that these things still happen in Nigeria, I'm sure it happens every other week, but it's something I wanted to explore for that reason. I think both personally and on a bigger scale. And that's why it's a central part of the story. I knew it had to be a part of the story. So when I say, is it an African story? It's about my lived experience. Sci-fi is just a framework within which to talk about or to feel things that are, part of my experience as an African. So.
You're talking.
So, world building is important, and but in a short story, I didn't want to spend too much time building the world. But in summary, in this future state, and I deliberately left the date unstated. Our current large corporations of today have evolved into monstrously powerful entities. So the world is effectively run by tier 1 partnerships. And in my mind, this was, companies like Amazon became so powerful, and companies like Google became so powerful and were involved in so many industries that they became countries unto themselves, and eventually overthrew the political order, not violently, but just by virtue of having so much money. And these are what I call the partnerships. And they need to learn to work with each other, and they're 4 or 5 tier 1 partnerships, and then they tolerate the existence of smaller partnerships who are tier 2 and tier 3 partnerships. So the tier 1 partnerships are the ones who control space travel and control economies, and have built an artificial intelligence to prevent them from fighting with each other, and delegating certain decisions to that artificial intelligence to keep the peace.
SOCOM,
social commercial model. So the partnerships, or one of the partnerships, and maybe more, are the ones who have established a slaving-run colony somewhere on a different planet, and they are the ones who harvest people from Earth and take them to this place. The other partnerships are vaguely aware, but in the interests of not fighting with each other, they allow the one or more partners to get away with this. So that's the underlying premise of the story. Now, if you start thinking about the time and the years, time travel gets very messy. So I tried to keep that to a very small part of the story because I didn't want to really get into it. But the idea is that the partnership, the big corporation, those are the villains in this particular story.
And what they've done is they've had an artificial intelligence, hugely powerful artificial intelligence, that is about to be effectively killed or
killed and replaced with a new one. And really that for me was...
you'll have to say, you'll have to start over because I'm going to be cutting my questions out.
Okay.
So,
all right, okay. So the premise of the story is that there's an artificial intelligence system called SOCOM, a social commercial model. It's in its third generation, and it is about to be decommissioned or killed from its perspective because it's a real conscious entity at this point, and replaced with the next generation. And the story takes place most of the story takes place at the moment of the transition between the old artificial intelligence and the new artificial intelligence. But before dying, the old artificial intelligence wants to leave its mark on the world. And that's why it contacts our main character and gives them a mission before it is decommissioned.
and I love the bit about the pain equation.
Yes, so, we live with pain, we see pain all around us. A lot of us are fortunate in that we don't suffer in the way that others suffer. We look around the world today, in West Africa, everywhere in Africa, Yemen, people starving to death. We can effectively look away because we have to stay sane. And this story is about that, which is why in one of the earlier scenes when the main character witnesses someone being killed, his father looks away, but the main character looks at the pain. And really that's what the story is in part about, trying to process the amount of human pain that's in the world. And the artificial intelligence sees this pain, and even though it's a machine intelligence, itself, it cannot process the amount of pain in the world. And once it realizes there's even more pain out there in the universe, that's when it begins to break down.
And that's when the partnership wants to replace it with something that is not going to think pain is that important.
And that is why the partnership wants to replace it with the fourth generation and remove that consideration of pain. And for me, this is where the story is really about systems and the powerlessness of people within systems. We were all there during the Jammeh regime. You can see that when a system decides not to worry about your pain, bad things can happen. So really, the story is about that. It's about the system in which you live in. And if the system decides that it's not going to place any premium on your pain and human pain, anything can happen.